Yet another strategic partnership was signed by China as an extension of its Belt and Road initiative to revive the old Silk Road. This time, the CSP Comprehensive Strategic Partnership was signed between the East Asian power and West Asian heavyweight Iran. Saturday, March the 27th, was the day the landmark agreement may have reset the course of history. How Iranians have reacted and what it will mean for this country is our major concern this day. A 25-year agreement with an upcoming superpower is only natural for it to provoke fear of the unknown in many. But really, it's not that far-fetched looking at the world's latest equations and how the JCPOA went for Iran. Why wouldn't this country commit to a new comprehensive agreement with an Eastern power when the West failed to share commitment to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? For answers, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. The United States and Europe and Israel are not happy about the Asian alliance. That in itself should put any concerned Iranians at ease. If they are not happy about it, it's probably good for Iran and China. Mr. Wafai is the Tehran University Chinese Studies Chief. He predicts the future in the context of the past.
Well,
for a country like Iran, which is facing Western sanctions and has plans for its future, for example, with regards to production, which the leader of the Islamic Revolution has emphasized, strengthening ties with the world's second largest economy in the long run can prove valuable and create many opportunities. So this agreement is definitely in Iran's interest.
Mr. Khorramshahr chairs the Foreign Relations Strategic Council. I asked him for an insight into the deal.
On the one hand, we have Europe and the United States, which signed a deal with us after many years, the JCPOA, saying that we'll give you benefits in exchange for concessions. We had to give them what they said, and they acknowledged that we offered them all at once. So what did they offer in return? Almost nothing. This is what the head of our central bank has said in public. Nothing. They kept us waiting for a long time, and then Mr. Trump came along and announced the end of the deal altogether. On the other hand, are other powers such as China and Russia. They did not boycott our oil, they did not block us financially, they did not constantly badger us on human rights issues, they did not pressure us on regional issues, instructing us where to be and what to say. They didn't tell us what the range, fuel, shape and size of our missiles had to be, and so on. If a wise person was to choose between these two blocks of powers, which one would he go for?
The alliance would mean economic, political and security cooperation between two countries celebrating 50 years of modern diplomatic ties and over 2,000 years of shared history. Rather than money, Iran would be paying in oil for construction of its critical ports and shores, and the cooperation would grant both countries a more convenient transit route connecting both their open waters. That I will have justified by a guest on the show.
Anyway, Iran's Chabahar port has an enormous capacity as it's located on China's Silk Road by the sea. However, China has a strategic rivalry with India. Their relations are fragile on some issues, and this will certainly affect Iran-China relations in this area. Meanwhile, there's Pakistan, which has good relations with both Iran and China. I think Pakistan can play a constructive role in this area. The Islamic Republic of Iran should strike a balance in its ties with Pakistan, China and India to define a maritime identity along the Chinese Silk Road.
It's like it came to the West as an electric shock. This Sino Iranian memorandum is another sign of maximum pressure sanctions failure. The US has been mulling how to return to the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal without lifting sanctions off Iran. While 2 months since Joe Biden took office as US president may not seem long, it was long enough for Iran to consider other prospective partners. That's the thing with love. Put it off, and it doesn't take long to get late. It may appear to be a task for the government, but with any national, international agreement as major as the one we are studying today, the approval of Parliament is of paramount importance. So we are here in Majlis to talk to an MP. Our MP of the day is Mr. Amouyi of the National Security Committee.
In the Parliament, we are pursuing this topic with precision. The Parliament's first working day in the new year was actually centered on this issue. The question is if the Parliament should be involved in the ratification of this agreement. From a legal point of view, this agreement is not binding. As a result, it is not applied to the Article 77 of the Constitution, which says all the agreements should be passed in the Parliament. Beyond that, however, the Parliament has its own supervisory obligations and has held sessions with the Deputy Foreign Minister in order to construe this document accurately and assess its benefits and possible flaws.
Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei said this country never trusted the West, as China and Iran agreed to increase bilateral trade more than tenfold to $600 billion in the next decade. To the greater alarm of the West, the hint of an Eastern axis emerging is a reality. While China depends on Iran for its energy imports, Russia needs Iran in terms of its new security architecture vision for the Middle East. This does not mean Iran, Russia and China would not at this point welcome the revival of the JCPOA, because that would mean sanctions waivers and easier trade among themselves.
China shouldn't be the only country with which we are signing such documents. We must define the same long-term cooperation with our neighboring countries. We should sign similar documents with other powerful countries in the Eurasian region, such as Russia and other emerging economic countries in Asia.
Interestingly, news of the Sino Iranian plan surfaced in 2016 when the JCPOA became operational. The JCPOA or nuclear deal was struck between Iran and the P5+1. That's the US, UK, France, Russia, China and Germany. It was to limit Iran's peaceful nuclear program in return for lifting economic nuclear-related UN sanctions off this country. Trump's USA unilaterally pulled out of the deal in 2018 and reinforced UN sanctions as US sanctions. Now, what's the significance here? Again, the JCPOA was originally intended to lift economic sanctions off Iran. This meant China could now deal with Iran, but with Donald Trump's reimposed sanctions, secondary sanctions for China, the Eastern Alliance was put off till today, when China also finds itself directly and separately under US sanctions.
In Asia, we have China in the east and Iran in the west. Both have suffered from Western colonization, especially by Britain and the United States. Both have been kept under severe pressure throughout history. They're being pressured by excuses such as human rights and any other issue you can think of. To set themselves free, they find themselves in a situation where they need to get together to take advantage of each other's capacities in the face of the West's growing pressure and enter into a contract to put their strengths together and be able to defend each other in such an environment.
So you see why there's been so much scaremongering against the Iran-China agreement by media stemming in unfriendly states, giving the Iranian people the idea its government would in desperate times be ceding parts of the country to China. Officials with an insight into detail of the deal are all on board with the agreement, even as we near presidential elections, and that is a time typically of bitter infighting.
The reason why countries are moving towards long-term cooperation is that they want to free themselves from the daily political turmoil and work together for their long-term interests. They show each other they're interested in friendship and development of their relations for a long time. Therefore, such documents cannot be related to domestic politics, or which government is incumbent, or which party has the power. In this context, this document, which was signed as a comprehensive cooperation program between Iran and China, shows that the two countries are ready to cooperate at the highest level.
The reason why Iran and China have picked each other is partly to secure their bilateral interests where the West has failed their interests. Of course, as with any major project, Iran will have to keep an eye on how business is conducted.
اما اینکه در اجرا ممکنه بعضی همکاری‌ها به چالش‌هایی برسه.
In practice, some collaborations may run into challenges. For example, the troll fishing was one of those challenges. The issue was proposed in the parliament. This type of fishing is not done anymore because of the environmental damages and other risks it poses. When drawing up a contract, all national interests consideration must be taken into account, whether environmental, political, territorial integrity, or security. All of these must be taken into account.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. As Western partners to the JCPOA are now putting a spanner in the works for Iran and China, JCPOA talks may have been a ray of hope in Iran-China talks as early as 2014. But that's all it was, a ray of hope by getting sanctions out of the way of the inevitable. The Cross-Asian Alliance means a great deal to the old continent's two ancient civilizations, all else aside.
یه مسئله‌ای که چینی‌ها تو این سال‌ها بهش تاکید داشتن.
One issue that the Chinese have emphasized over the years and continue to do so is the establishment of political and economic relations on the basis of culture. The Silk Road provides the basis for this idea of Belt and Road. The Silk Road is not just about economics. It connects countries whose cultures are intertwined. Chinese leaders openly say one of the reasons they've proposed the Silk Road initiative was because of its cultural aspect.
What are the Chinese looking for in the region? The Chinese are looking for stable oil and energy sources in our region. They now consume 11.5 million barrels per day and seek to ensure that the investments they make here are safe. No security in the region is possible without the participation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is looking for a loyal customer and investor to expand its economy like any other nation. All countries are now talking about attracting foreign investment.
We've still plenty more to cover, but first a quick review of other media outlets to see what others have to say. Do bear with me. And here's what other outlets say. The Times of Israel points to how the deal may reduce US influence. Iran-China sign huge 25-year strategic deal could reduce US regional influence. The deal signed Saturday could undermine US leverage over Iran ahead of expected negotiations, and it can lessen American influence in the Middle East. Ongoing US sanctions against Iran could hamper its trade with China despite Saturday's agreement, however. Iran's government and people are striving, as they always have, to broaden relations with trustworthy, independent countries like China. Iran's leader Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei said back in 2016, describing the then proposed cooperation agreement as correct and reasonable. Iran has, since Trump exited the Iran nuclear deal, pulled away from restrictions imposed under the deal, under those sanctions, in order to put pressure on other signatories, Germany, France, Britain, Russia and China, to provide new economic incentives to offset US sanctions. Iran is also believed to be maneuvering for leverage ahead of expected negotiations with the Biden administration. The National points to how the Middle East might change structure under the agreement. Will the China-Iran deal change the Middle East? It should come as no surprise that China and Iran signed a 25-year agreement this week. What is interesting, however, is the timing. It comes within 100 days of US President Joe Biden taking office and his desire to reconfigure America's relations with both countries. Now, it seems Beijing and Tehran have moved past the era of fearing US sanctions following the departure of Mr. Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump. Interestingly, even as they prioritize their relations with Iran, China and Russia are also deepening cooperation with the Persian Gulf states. Last month, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov toured the region, as did Wang Yi, his Chinese counterpart. Mr. Lavrov also visited Beijing to coordinate the two countries' strategies regarding relations with the US, the Persian Gulf states, and the Middle East amid the Biden administration's perceived downgrading of the region in its list of priorities. A word from Tehran Times. The Iranian paper chooses China. China is an ideal partner for Iran's pluralistic diplomacy. Smart Iranians must have learned from the history of Iran since the 19th century that only when Iran establishes balanced and pluralistic diplomacy will it better defend its own interests and gain more benefits. In a multipolar world, Iran certainly needs pluralistic diplomacy. In recent years, there have been many analytical articles about Look East in Iran, and the international academic community is also studying Iran's Look East. If Iran's Look East more than a decade ago was just to respond to US sanctions, currently Iran's Look East should have a different meaning. It should become one of Iran's long-term strategies to safeguard its own interests. Eastern countries have their own development philosophy. For example, compared with Western powers, China knows better that countries need to respect each other. As a major Asian country, Iran should have more optimistic expectations for the future of the East. And that would be it for the news segment. Back to our narration. For China, comprehensive strategic partnerships are a standard foreign policy tool. It has signed them with over 80 countries, and it has been signing roadmaps for economic and security cooperation with countries across the Middle East. This would ensure it does not provoke regional rivalries. This is apart from the fact that China has singular interests with each Middle Eastern country. Now, Iran is a regional superpower rich in oil, so it can't very well be omitted from the equation. And Iran, for its part, won't sit back to get left out as China strikes deals in the neighborhood. And anyway, all aside, power equations in the world are changing. China has something to say for itself and the clout to secure its interests.
You need to consider that the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf also have ports that are safe, advanced and quite attractive to Chinese. So there is this competitive environment for Iran to create an attraction for the Chinese side to move toward Iran. Of course, Iran's energy bases like Asaluye oil and gas fields are important factors that can serve as a starting point for Iran to enter into negotiations with China. This means that outside the issue of the Silk Road, which is an international plan, we can begin two-way cooperation with China in the energy sector. That is, we can use the 25-year deal to act directly and without the need of any intermediaries to transfer energy from Iranian ports to Chinese ports or any other ports they would determine.
The centers of power in the international system are shifting and changing. The 21st century is a century of Asia. The center of power is transferred from the West, which used to be in Europe, to the East, that is Asia. Due to the shifting of the center of power, new coalitions are also being formed.
Also, Iran and China are natural partners in what is an extension of the One Belt, One Road initiative. For China, the initiative guarantees its access to the four corners of a world it is set to dominate as the soon-to-be #1 economic power. And Iran, apart from guaranteeing oil exports to this country, is naturally located on the choke point between Asia and Europe. China is taking a great leap forward in asserting itself as a superpower, and its interests in the Middle East are tied with those of Iran. In the power struggle between the US and China, the scales have tilted in favor of China, and Iran will be acting as a balancing element.
One of the characteristics of Chinese diplomacy is the principle of separation. The Chinese easily communicate with the Israelis and at the same time with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Most important is the United States. The US is at war with China. They're engaged in a trade war, but the relations are still there. China has separated its ties with Iran and other states in the region. If you think carefully, the Chinese leader's latest trip to the region showed the same principle. Before he visited Iran, the Chinese leader paid a visit to Saudi Arabia. This has a message for us. We have a Persian poem that says everyone is important in its way. China has a distinct definition for diplomacy with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they won't interfere with each other.
I've said much of the agreement, but little of its contents. What Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif described as a long-term practical promotion will provide a win-win platform for the comprehensive development of cooperation in trade, politics, economy, culture, defense and security between the two ancient Asian civilizations. It will provide equal sovereignty and secure an indigenous development model. It will promote and facilitate joint production in the fields of oil, industry, mining and energy-related fields based on national sustainable development and environmental concerns. Iran's effective participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, cooperation in the fields of infrastructure, communication, railroad, port and air and telecommunications, financial, banking and customs cooperation and deregulation, cooperation in the development of special and free trade and industrial zones, including on the Makran coast, strengthening non-oil cooperation with a focus on the knowledge-based field, facilitating private sector cooperation by removing barriers to cooperation, tourism, media, non-governmental organization, friendship associations, and academic cooperation. The list goes on and on.
If you analyze foreign media, including Monitor, Iran International and the BBC, they're saying that the means of maximum pressure campaign with its murky and dangerous methods have taken Iran thus far to a point where they either can achieve what they were after or they won't. And if this deal relieves that pressure all of a sudden, this extraordinary disgraceful investment they had made will be rendered useless. So they're drawing comparisons with the Treaty of Turkmenchai, talking about selling off the country and such. One of the reasons behind these histrionics is that they sold off their homeland and this deal is going against it.
Zarif also clarified misconceptions about the plan, posting on Instagram. This document is not a contract, but has provided the grounds for future contracts. It does not create any exclusive rights in any field, and the deployment of any military force has not been foreseen in this document, and there is no possibility to take over a base. Regarding military cooperation, the agreement does not promise a steadfast military alliance, because for one thing, China's Middle East arms trade is directed towards Iran's neighbors who are willing to pay in petrodollars rather than petroleum itself. Also, Iran seeks air defense weaponry, while China itself struggles to manufacture jet engines, and its new drones have crashed in the field. China's main sales in West Asia are tanks.
More than 80 countries in the world now have China as their first trading partner. Not just Iran currently has China as its top trading partner. In 2020, our non-oil foreign trade with China alone was over $19 billion. Well, this is a considerable amount in Iran's foreign trade. And in the current situation, the American media and American institutions themselves reported that Iran's oil sales to China last month were close to 1 million barrels per day. These are all signs that China's potentials are currently expanding. All countries tend to design long-term, mutually beneficial relations with such a country. Iran is no exception.
Our proposal in the Foreign Relations Strategy Committee has been that sanctioned nations form what we called an anti-sanctions bloc. It's natural for them to come together. The countries which they closed the way for is now opening the path for each other in financial issues. It's no longer a matter of ideology. We aren't communists and neither are they. We don't want to convert them to Islam, nor do they want to make us communists. Like everywhere in the world, it's a game played by several powers. You close the way for us, but the way is open for us elsewhere.
Europeans have been conveying to Iranians that China can't be good for them as a state that won't care about human rights issues in this country. But as early as November 2016, the UK and China agreed to deepen ties between their financial services industries. Britain was pushing to establish London as a global hub for Chinese finance. In West Asia, China signed cooperation deals with Iraq in 2015, Saudi Arabia in 2016, and the United Arab Emirates in 2018.
For a long time, the US is said to have shifted its foreign relations activities from this region, once deemed as quite important for Washington, to the Indo-Pacific region. This means that the US presence in the region will be diminishing. That would open up opportunities in the area for other powers, including China, and also regional powers like Iran.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know where we are going to take you next. Bye for now.